detail. It has pictures, which I always like. That's always helpful. I feel more accomplished when I can read a page faster because half of it's a picture and I can get through the So that's this kind of a book that we're talking about here. It will be, it's a good book. If you say, well, I'm not going to buy all those books on the bibliography, of course I don't know why you wouldn't do that. But if you decide that you can't spend the money on the bibliography, one book that I would encourage you to consider buying, I bought this one used on Amazon, and you might be able to get this one used and go through it. This is sort of a one-stop shop for a lot of what we're discussing. I would encourage you to get that one. Several other books are down here that you can take a look at. This is my collection of books that I've been using. I have a few others, library books, that I've gotten from a local seminary, but I didn't put those out because I'm in big trouble if I lose those. So anyway, but these are ones that you can take a look at. You might find that you like one or two of them, and you want to don't steal mine. Go ahead and just write down the information. Actually, all of those are on that bibliography as well. You can circle them. Take a look and peruse afterwards, and take a look at the different books that are there to give you more of a understanding of the subject. The other thing I want to do is, this is a neat little comparison. It's a comparison chart. You can get this off of Amazon. At least I got mine off of Amazon. Bible translations comparison. I'll put that down there too. You can take a look at it. It compares 20 different translations. It's got a lot of information. It's all pretty basic on one end. But if you want to just kind of compare right next to each other, where the different manuscripts, which versions use which manuscripts, you might find some things surprising. For example, did you know that the New King James Old Testament manuscript is a little different actually the Old Testament manuscript for the King James is somewhat different than the Old Testament manuscript for the New American Standard, for example. Or did you know this? Did you know that the New American Standard New Testament manuscript that's primarily used is completely different text, or not completely, none of them are completely different, but is a different text than the NIV. You have two different texts for the New Testament. And both of those are different than the King James and the New King James use. The King James and the New King James use the exact same text for the New Testament. Exactly the same. So anyway, this explains all of that. It also will tell you different reading levels of the different translations. So they've been graded. How many of you all think, what is the hardest grading level of all of the translations, would you think? Good, you're right, the King James. That's 12th grade. What is the next one? Okay, good, right, the New American Standard, that's the next one. Okay, that's 11th grade. New American Standard is hard. It's very wooden. It's very technical. How about, what's the next, what do you think, what are some easy ones?
Yeah, Message.
Okay, the Message is I don't think that's okay. The Message is interesting. ESV has a pretty low, ESV is around an 8th grade level. How about the New King James? Where do you think New King James falls? 9th grade level. Good, okay. So that just sort of gives you an idea of just, if you want to look at a different basic overview of everything. It'll tell you about the basic manuscript families in the Greek New Testament. Did you know there's 3, not 2? Or at least 3 basic ones, okay? Not only 2. Anyway, there's lots of information in that, and that's the Reader's Digest version of all of that. And you say, well, why don't you just buy us this instead of giving us that bibliography? Well, if you want to know why this is the case and verify that, then that'll help. All right, so that's what I want to go over, just as far as different books that we can look into. And I encourage you to pick up, if no other book, I encourage you to pick up this one. This one would be a big help to you. I'll put it down there so you can take a look at that. Let's go ahead and go to Lord in prayer, and then we'll get into our study today. Father, I just thank you, Lord, for the privilege of being able to go through this tonight. Thank you that you have so far maintained our freedom in this country, that we can freely teach your word and preach it. And you've given us all kinds of resources so that we can really understand where our Bible comes from. I pray, Lord, that as a result of tonight, there would be a greater confidence and encouragement in knowing that in the reality of how your word has such solid footing. And I pray that this would be clearly evident tonight. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. All right. So we're going to look at the transmission of the Old Testament text. We're going to look at various manuscripts and that kind of thing. This is important. I'm just not working any notes again. A couple of considerations to start off with. The term manuscript, we'll start real simple. Manuscript just means it's written in by hand. Okay, so anything prior to the Gutenberg printing press is a manuscript that you had to write by hand. You think of manual labor, that's hand labor. So manuscript is written by hand. There's no original manuscripts at all in either testament. Okay, what we're talking about is the original autographs that the actual authors penned. You don't have any for the Old Testament, and you don't have any for the New Testament. They're all gone. Okay, so the original manuscript that Isaiah penned is not available for us. Maybe this is working now. Good. All right. I thought you guys were doing something.
No, you have to start the first slide with the iPad and then click over.
That. Ah, nice. Okay. All right. By the time this whole series is over, I'll figure out this thing. All right. So why are there the question we'll just ask real quickly, why are there no manuscripts? Why is there no original autographs? Probably in some cases we're talking about age and decay because many of them are written on animal skin. Jewish calamities such as the Babylonian captivity, a lot of the older manuscripts would have been destroyed. This is probably the most likely and seems to be unquestioned by most of the different scholars. They all seem to agree on this. And the reason for that is we actually have documentation on the scribes' methodology in doing this. But basically, the scribes disposed of the ones that showed signs of wear. So if once a manuscript got old, they would actually have a whole ceremony of just letting the manuscript, of disposing of the manuscript. They did it all very, very reverently and very respectively, but they felt it was more respectful to dispose the manuscript in that way than to keep using the manuscript when it was inferior because of wear. And so we don't have, original manuscripts. But let me just ask this question, and this is just a question to think about. One more is that people would seek to destroy the work of the Bible from time to time as well throughout history, and so you might have a reduction of manuscripts from that. Of course, we're going to find that God really preserves his word very well, and we'll see that in just a few moments. But why do you suppose, I just thought about this, why do you suppose that God would see fit in his sovereignty to not allow us to have the original autographs, the original manuscripts? And I'm going to answer the question. That was sort of a rhetorical question. I think so. I think it's because, this is my personal opinion, but I think it's probably because we would worship those manuscripts. Okay, we are so inclined to base our faith on a form, or to base our faith on an object, that we're just so inclined to do that. God puts his word above his very name, but he does not want us to worship a form. He doesn't want us to worship an object. That's a graven image. It would be a conflict for us to have God's word be a graven image. I mean, that would be, so I think, I personally, as a personal opinion, but I think in God's sovereignty, I could be wrong about this, but I think in God's sovereignty, he allowed the autographs to just move off of the scene. He could have, in his sovereignty, chosen to preserve them by his own omnipotence, but he chose not to do that. A couple of things when we're looking at manuscript formats, just so you know the vernacular. As you're reading some of these books, I know you all are going to go home and read these, you'll need to know the terminology. Scrolls, of course, you know what they are. They're things that are rolled up. And then you have the term codex, which is basically a book. At a certain point in history, they moved from, the book was sort of where the codex was invented. It was interesting, though, that when the codex was invented, they didn't stop using scrolls, even though books are far more efficient. I mean, really far more efficient. But people are just not inclined to change, even if there's no practical reason to keep using scrolls. For a long time, they continue to use them for no other reason that I could find than just people are not inclined to change. But eventually, people did kind of realize that scrolls are a little bit, kind of not as efficient as books, and so they have that. We have codexes. Papyri as well is and parchment. What's the difference between papyri and parchment? Papyri is made from skin. All right, good. Okay, so you have the differences there. Let's go. Can you all see this? Probably not. All right. You all need better glasses for next time. So no. No. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to email you all of this after we're finished, so you will be able to see it when it's up close. But basically, what you have is a timeline here of when the different texts, when they were discovered, and what they date back to, the different Old Testament manuscripts. So you'll have all of that I will email to you on the slide, and you'll be able to get that. But you'll know where to identify it just by looking at that picture. And so we'll get into that as we move forward here. All right, maybe I'll push the button this time. Okay, the Old Testament text. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start moving our way through history and looking at the different texts in order that they were written in. In other words, how they dated. Some books and lectures would take it based upon would go in order of when they were discovered. You could do that. We could do that tonight. But I just think, the way my brain works, I would rather start from the earliest and go forward as far as when the manuscripts were written, rather than having to think through when they were discovered and then trying to compare the two. So that's just the way my brain works. I think it would be easier for me anyway, and hopefully it'll be easier for you as well. But I will point out when they were discovered as we go along. The Old Testament text prior to AD 100, okay? There are, of course, questions. Let's just ask some questions concerning the early text. Until 1952, or right around there, little was known about the Hebrew text of this time period. So we had, prior to 1952, we had really very few, we have a few and I'll mention those, but very few manuscripts that were prior to AD 100. Some examples that we did have was we had a Septuagint, that's the Old Testament Greek translation of the Old Testament. So when you hear the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. What language is the Old Testament written in? Good, Hebrew. Okay. The Greek translation of Hebrew we did have, and that was written prior to AD 100. So keep that in mind. Septuagint does factor into things from time to time as we'll learn as we move along here. Then you also have the Nash Papyrus, and as far as we can tell, that was before AD 100. And I'll show you a couple of pictures of these in just a minute. But those are prior to AD 100 that we didn't have up to 1952. However, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a lot prior to that time. It provided a great number of manuscripts from 2000 to 250 BC all the way to AD 50. You know, before the Dead Sea Scrolls, just to kind of keep you aware, we'll compare this to the New Testament, we actually had New Testament manuscripts that were written, our earliest New Testament manuscripts were written, we had them, and they were older than our earliest Old Testament manuscripts. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. But with the introduction of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you had a lot of scrolls that were found, a good deal. In every book of the Bible, with the exception of Esther, and I think Song of Solomon, were the two that weren't found. Everything else, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had at least segments from, and most of the time whole books. But from this time period, you had the Hebrew script was different than what you would read in a more modern Hebrew manuscript. They called it Paleo-Hebrew, in fact. So it was sort of a very, very primitive Hebrew. The earliest writings had no spaces at all. Could you imagine reading text with no spaces? You would run into problems, and there's like this one, for example. Okay, if we did this, we're doing this with English because you can't read Hebrew, right? Okay, so let me ask you a question. No spaces here. What is this saying? All right, well, let's just practice this for a minute. It says God is nowhere, or it may say God is now here. If you're finding this in the Bible, which one do you suppose it's saying? God is now here, right? Do you suppose, now here's my point in saying this, do you suppose that even in the earliest stages of translation, using your mind to determine what would be in the Bible would help you translate, right? It would. It was necessary. Translators did not, it's not just a matter of blind translation. Anybody who has any experience with translation knows that it isn't a word for word, I'm just going to translate like this. Nothing is like that with translation. Okay? There's always some level of interpretation when you're translating. How many of you all know a different language outside of English? Okay? Know it well enough to know what I'm saying here, basically. G definitely does. You know how many languages, G? A bunch, right? Five different languages. Am I right on this? Thank you. Don't tell me I'm wrong. No, it definitely is true. There's no question about that. The idea of a word-for-word translation is impossible. Okay? That's just not really realistic. You can have more, what I would call wooden translations, more that are built on a particular philosophy of translation. We're getting into translations. I'm digressing here a little bit. But just to understand that in the earliest manuscripts, you would have these kinds of things that had interpretive problems. And keep that in mind because this was fixed later on by a really good system, and you'll see what that is in a few minutes. Amos 6:12 would be an example of how the wording, we won't take the time to look at that, but how the wording order and how it was all, you could mean two different things based upon that. That was one of the ones they sort of struggled with, knowing which way to go. The context actually tells you which one, but anyway. Just give you some pictures of the Septuagint. There's those two are just basic pictures. Of course, you'll see these better when I send them to you, but you'll see it's just rows and rows, in this case of Greek letters. Most of them are uncials, which means they're capitals. And then you have the written text out here, which is for somebody who actually knows Greek, is like so much better. It's this I'm squinting to pick out words, and then when it's actually on paper, I'm looking at it and going, I can actually read it, so it's always a blessing. I like it. It's a little humorous when my dad and I will watch a bug show and something Hebrew or Greek will come on and say, "Can you read that? Can you read that?" I'm squinting for no reason. It's really, really hard if it's not on paper and there's no spaces. All right. Pictures of the Nash Papyrus. Okay, this is that one really, really old one that we had prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then finally, pictures of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, you can see the difference in the completion of them and everything. And so anyway, we'll talk about what all this means in a few moments. During this time period, you had very significant, really actually all the way through, you have extremely significant involvement of the scribes. You don't have scribes in the New Testament writings, but you do have scribes in the Old Testament. Well, what did these scribes do? Well, their involvement was from 500 BC all the way through 8100. The early scholars, according to the Babylonian Talmud, were called Sopharim because they used to count all of the letters in the Torah. They would count every letter to make sure that they were getting things right as far as when they transmitted from one manuscript to another. I'm not talking about translation here, I'm talking about transmission. So when they're transmitting, they're just copying over. Okay? What do we do now when we want to copy something? Throw it on a copy machine. Okay? They, of course, didn't have that. So you had to have somebody to do all of that. And the scribes were very, very meticulous in what they were doing. We actually find sort of this general writing process in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, and I'm sorry, that's not right. It should be 2 Chronicles 36. I'm not sure why that says that. And Jeremiah 36 as well. And we won't take the time to look at that for now. But what you have basically when you're talking about the method of scribes is everything was, God it'll say, the prophet would say, thus saith the Lord, Isaiah, whoever, would say, thus saith the Lord. And the scribes would be sitting down and listening to every word, and they would copy down every word. Sometimes God would say, speak it and write it. And the scribes, when they knew, okay, I need to write it, and they would listen to it, and they would write it down for generations to come. That was the original work of the scribes. The Old Testament was inscribed on many letter scrolls. For the sake of continuity, this is just interesting, for the sake of continuity, the scribes would write the final words of one scroll in the beginning of another. So they wanted to make sure that they were not missing anything. So the Old Testament scribes, they would to make sure that nobody thought that there were no gaps, they would always start when they move from one scroll to the other. You don't have to do this with a book, right? But imagine massive scrolls, and you have massive scrolls that you can't even fit necessarily the entire Old Testament book in one scroll, so you got to move to the next one. Well, they're going to write the end of the one scroll on the beginning of the next, so that you could see the continuity. They're very careful about that kind of thing. And scrolls were used in synagogues even after codex became popular. I mentioned that earlier, for private use in the 2nd century in the synagogues. I guess they just like opening the things or something. It is kind of cool, open them all up, and so they kept them. The origin of the scribes' texts. There is some disagreement in this area. It's hard to tell, when you're looking at ancient things and you weren't there, what the different texts are and things like that. But our best understanding is that you have three basic families of texts. You have the Palestinian text, that is the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Masoretic text only of Chronicles, that's actually important, and the several Qumran texts. Then you have, and the Qumran text came from where? Okay, good. Qumran came from Qumran actually, but just north of the Dead Sea. Okay, they're part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You have number 2, Babylon, the Babylon Masoretic text. Okay, it was generally the Babylonian family of texts. Usually they were preserved. The reason they come with that name is they were preserved during the Babylonian captivity. And you have in Egypt the Septuagint. So those are just sort of major families. Folks, let me just ask you this question. Who knows this? Which is the most reliable of these 3 families? By far, I heard, if you said Septuagint, you're not right. By far the Masoretic text, and you'll see that in a few moments. Okay, Septuagint's a good guess. We were talking about that earlier, but it wouldn't be right. The Masoretic text is the most reliable. We'll see why in a few moments. The development of the Hebrew vowels, just so you understand exactly a little bit about this. The original manuscripts, the original autographs, did not likely contain vowels at all. Okay, what's a vowel? Okay. Does any English word not have a vowel? I don't know of any, but there aren't very many if there are. Okay, I'm sure there is some. Somebody played Scrabble a lot and figured that out. But anyway, most of the time there's not a lot of vowels. There's a lot of vowels, and you can't make words very well without vowels. And you certainly can't pronounce words without vowels, right? So So they didn't have any vowels because prior to, our modern day, I mean, when I say modern, I mean ancient modern. Yeah, prior to more modern days, you didn't, most everything was spoken. You had some things written down, but most things were spoken, and people didn't need to have the vowels written because they knew how to pronounce the word without the vowels. Have you ever tried that before, though? You can take English words and you can write just the consonants, and you have space, as long as there's space in between. A lot of times, your brain will automatically fill in the vowels for you. How many of you have ever tried that before? Okay. On Facebook, sometimes you'll see people try to do that. Anyway. Well, it's the same kind of concept. You don't have to have vowels if you really know the language well. They got to be there, but you don't have to have them written down. And so the original text didn't have vowels. The old manuscripts didn't have any vowels, except occasionally it looks like perhaps they used consonants to sometimes work as vowels. The Masoretic text, the Samaritan text, Pentateuch, and the Qumran materials used matres lectionis, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, on an imprecise system of vowel endings. This eventually moved to the Tiberian pointing system that was widely accepted and used today. This was perfected by a scribe named Aaron ben Moses ben Asher. You don't have to remember all those names, but that Ben Asher name would be an important name. You'll see that in all kinds of books on this. That Ben Asher family of scribes. Okay, so they developed vowel pointings. They didn't come till later. We'll talk about that. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later. What vowel pointings are. And there's a reason I want to talk about that. This is God's provision for it. These vowel pointings are God's provision. They were not inspired because they didn't have them in the beginning. But I'm telling you, if you've ever tried to read Hebrew without vowel pointings, it's impossible. You can't tell the present what tense it is or what mood it is. You can't tell these kinds of things. So you have to have vowel pointings. Gee, can you read Hebrew? Okay. Anyway, no. But you got to have the vowel pointings because we don't know how things were pronounced. We'll see a little bit more why that's important for you guys. All right, now we're going to move now from AD 100 to 500 and look at the Old Testament text in that time period. We have the standardizing of the text in AD 100. Before that time, you had the Masoretes that were really preserving the text. But they decided to really try to standardize everything during this time period. The text appears to have been standardized between these time periods. The Hebrew text from this time period was discovered in the Masada, the Nahel, Heber, and the Wadi Merabah. You tell I just read these other books. The Masada is cool. These are all around. These are all, of course, in Palestine. They're around the Dead Sea, the location of the Dead Sea. And this, for example, is the Masada. This is like a plateau, like a real high plateau. An ancient fortification in southern district of Israel, situated on the top of an isolated rock plateau, akin to a mesa. Rachel, you've probably seen mesas, right? Okay, so this is sort of like that. And Dad's seen it. He goes out west and is a Western expert, even though he grew up in the region. On the eastern edge of the Judean desert, overlooking the Dead Sea, Herod the Great built palaces for himself on the mountain fortified Masada between 37 and 31 BCE. So we've got, BC. We've got, that was a mistake. So we've got this plateau called the Masada, and they found scrolls up there. How many of you have ever been to the Masada? Anybody here? One day. I'd love to do this. That'd be so cool. Okay. Then we have the Nahel Heber. It's actually Nahal Heber. And the Arabic would be Wadi al-Kabah. It is an intermediate stream in the Judean desert that flows from the Yada area to the Dead Sea. Okay, so you have another place. And then then you have this other place as well that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. All of these different places where they discovered all of these different scrolls. I want to point out that during this time you had also another family of scribes. You had the Ben Asher family of the Masoretic scribes that were continuing, but you had this group of scribes called the Tannaim scribes. And they made some significant contributions for us. They're from AD 20 through 200. And they compiled the traditions expounding the Old Testament laws called the Mishnah. All right, and many of them would not have been correct interpretations of the Old Testament law, actually. And we have Christ coming on the scene and pointing out the right interpretation of the Old Testament law. But one of the things that's very helpful for us that's included in the Mishnah is their meticulous rules that were developed for preserving Old Testament texts in the synagogues. They had I read the rules, and I didn't put all of them down here. You have to buy the books to get the rules. But the rules are just meticulous on making sure that everything is correct. And God really used legalistic scribes who Christ condemned to be very meticulous when it came to the preservation of the Old Testament text. And it helps us, and we're going to make the assumption, I think it's a safe assumption, that they weren't the only scribes that were meticulous. That really all the scribes, the Masoretes, we know that to be the case, were all extremely meticulous in preserving the Old Testament law and all of the Old Testament for us. The Amoram scribes were between 200 and 500 AD. They were the forming of the Talmud. It included further expositions and stipulations included in the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is a commentary on the Mishnah. So you're getting pretty far removed from the actual Old Testament here, but they added to this as well. They did not. I think now they really do sort of see it as almost canonical or biblical, but at the time of the writings, probably they didn't. Centered in two different areas, Babylonia and Palestine. They made minor corrections to the text noted in the Biblia Hebraica, and we'll see what I'm talking about in a few minutes here. So during this time period, you have a standardized text, but they are going to make some minor corrections as they go through them. All right, and you find that they're going to do this all the way through. Next time period, the Old Testament is from 500 to 1000 AD. This is the time, sort of the time as of the Masoretes, where they really are going to do a lot of very significant work. Wegner says, these scribes were extremely careful and treated the text with great reverence. They made meticulous notes regarding the text, from regarding the number of letters used in the book to indicating the middle letter of the book, so that they can make sure they have it all right. From about AD 400 to 800, you have vowel points, accents, mazaras, as well as many other scribal corrections were added. Okay, so at this point I just want to explain that basically it's not until this point. You have the text that's standardized, but at this point the Masoretes went in and they included these vowel pointings, and they are extremely helpful for us. If they had not, they're not inspired, but had they not put these in here, someone today would never have been able to read the Hebrew text because they wouldn't have known what the tenses are. Things. They could have known the basic vocabulary. You can know vocabulary without the vowel pointings, but you don't know any grammar or syntax without the vowel pointings. And so, or not much anyway. And so they added these vowel pointings where basically it's like adding A-E-I-O-U to our words, which allowed us to be able to interpret these things. And they were so meticulous at doing so, and they understood what they were doing, that it was a great help for us during this time period. You have Masoretic notations that go on during this time period. The Masoretes added small diamonds over letters or words to indicate reservations, either textual or otherwise, or in content. The reading is about the reading in about 15 places. One example is in Numbers 3:39. They question the inclusion of Aaron there. All of these different points that the Masoretic, the questions that they had, none of them had any serious doctrinal significance. They're just things that they're a little unsure about. They're extremely honest. And they looked at what the manuscript evidence they had. They said, "No, I'm not sure that's really supposed to be there." So they just made indications on things in order for us to be able to, in order for them to be honest about things. There were some letters that were suspended during that time, and then they had these things called perpetual jeer. They notations made from the scribes that felt that the text was unsatisfactory for some reason. Or in some cases, they didn't want to add vowel pointings in some cases. Like the most notable one would be the ineffable tetragrammaton. So what is that? When you see in your King James Bible, you see the term Lord, and it's capitalized L-O-R-D, usually there's a word behind that, it's Yahweh. And with that particular word, you don't find any vowel pointings. And the reason for that is that they did not feel you should be speaking that word. It's such a revered word, the word of God, His name, that it's not something to be spoken, so they didn't include vowel pointings in that. It just kind of gives us an indication to the kind of reverence that these scribes had for God's word and for God, and it sort of speaks to their motive, if you would, in preserving the text for us. All right, so then we get to the Hebrew text after 1,000, just so you're aware of this. The final menorah indicates the number of verses and middle verse, so that was added after 1,000. You have chapter divisions. Do you realize you don't have chapter divisions until 1150 AD? Do you realize that? No chapter divisions prior to that point. Psalms are not chapters. Psalms are songs. You had divisions in Psalms. Okay? But the other books of the Bible, you didn't have divisions. So the chapters, folks, are not inspired. That's why sometimes it seems as though they got it wrong. Okay? Particularly in the New Testament, there'll be times, I'm not as good with Hebrew, but there are times in the Greek and I think, I don't know why they put a chapter division there. That is a flow of thought. Now, most of the time they got it right. But sometimes it's like, the flow of thought should have continued there. They're continuing the thought. They should not have separated that. But the chapter divisions are not inspired. They're just there but they're really helpful, right? Okay? I don't know what I would do if we didn't have chapter or verse divisions, because I'd be saying, open your Bible up to, open your Bible up to Isaiah and the 4,685th word, and we don't have to count it out. So we're very thankful for chapter and verse divisions. Verse divisions were added earlier. Actually, we have verse divisions added earlier in 900 with these two different codexes. Here's some examples of the codexes during this time period as well. The Aleppo Codex, so these are in book form. The Cairo Codex and the Leningrad Codex. All right, recent Hebrew Bible. Most editions of the most recent edition of the Masoretic text is the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, 1977. Okay, that's really late, right? That's just like a few years ago. Some of you all can remember that. Okay, so you have this final standardization of the Hebrew text at that point. So you would have the King James, of course, would not be in fact, many of the modern translations are actually still prior to this point. They wouldn't have factored this one in much at all. This was compiled by these two men. And the text is called the Diplomatic Edition because it follows the text of one Hebrew manuscript. It is in the Ben Asher family tradition, but was thought to be the most accurate of all the manuscripts. The problem with this, folks, is that this is the only text being referred to. You're not factoring in a lot of the text, basically. And so you have to be a little careful with that one. Wegner says this. He says, "We are extremely indebted to the generations of scribes whose meticulous work and constant care maintained their sacred traditions and preserved an accurate text. But without any original autograph for comparison, how can the accuracy of these texts be determined? This is where the study of Old Testament textual criticism enters." Okay, now, we're going to cover Old Testament textual criticism next week, but I want to introduce a couple of things this week. Sometimes there are certain groups of people that have given this concept of textual criticism sort of a bad name. A lot of rhetoric surrounds this concept of textual criticism. There is some kinds of textual criticism that is entirely wrong, where they are doubting the text, that there is actually doubt involved in the text that they're. So there are actually liberal theologians will have what is called higher textual criticism. And that's the kind of textual criticism where they're actually trying to find error in the text so they can discount it. That's entirely wrong, in my opinion. It's not my opinion, it's wrong. All right? We don't doubt Scripture. We never doubt the inspiration of the Word of God. That is a foundation of our faith. We make the faith assumption that God has inspired the original manuscripts, right? So what has He inspired? He inspires the original writings. That those are God-breathed. What our job, not our job, but what the job of those who have, that God has used providentially throughout the ages to preserve His Word, what His job, really the church's job is to do the very best they can to determine what is the most accurate of all of the text, that is going to be closest to the autographs. We're assuming the autographs are inspired. We're making that assumption. Our job is to say, okay, what is the closest we can get to them, right? And that's what we call lower textual criticism. What we need to realize when we're talking about lower textual criticism is that there is such an immense amount of agreement that you're not going to find any doctrinal differences in the Old Testament, or the New Testament for that matter. And you have really less, in the Old Testament, in my opinion, you have less, you have some debate, and Joel's going to talk about that a little bit more. He is really better with the Old Testament than I am, as far as this kind of stuff. He's done more research on it. But what he's going to explain is that there is some differences in what the old, like the King James, for instance. The King James used several different, the Masoretic text they used primarily, but they used several other texts as well. But the New King James uses only the Masoretic text. A lot of people do not know that. They know they can't place their faith in the Old King James by itself. They know they got to go back at least to the original language. They go back to the original language, the Old Testament, and they say, okay, well, I believe in the preserved text is the Masoretic text of the Old Testament and the TR of the New Testament. These are the preserved texts. And the problem with that is that the Old Testament, the Old Testament King James Version doesn't always use the Masoretic text. Sometimes it translates from the Septuagint. Sometimes it translates from another text entirely. And what you find, you'll see this I saw this even growing up, but I know you'll see significant differences in Proverbs between an Old Testament, an old King James and a New King James. Because the New King James said, we're going to stick with the Masoretic text all the way through. And the Old King James sometimes diverted to another family of manuscripts. And so there's sometimes in Proverbs, for example, where you're going to see meanings that are very different. And it's not always because there's a translational difference, it's actually a manuscript difference. Now, that shouldn't shake us, folks, for this reason. You don't have any doctrinal contradictions. There are no doctrinal contradictions. And our faith rests in the truth of the Word of God that has clearly been preserved for us over time. And so what we need to do is just understand that you're going to have occasional scribal errors, or you're going to have discrepancies here and there. But the overall manuscript support and the meticulousness with which God has chosen to preserve His Word in the Old Testament, and He's done it in an entirely different way in the New Testament. It is interesting that God's providence is very different in how He preserved the Old Testament from the New Testament. The Old Testament, if you want to sum it all up, God really used the Jewish scribes to make sure that everything was correct, and that there was just a great, it was just really transmitted well and eventually translated for us. The New Testament didn't have scribes. What you have in the New Testament is a multiplicity of manuscripts. And you have very earlier manuscripts, actually, than we originally had for the Old Testament until the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let me just recap this as well, though. So prior to the 1950s, the primary texts that we had were from the Masoretes, roughly around 900 AD, some before, some after. Okay. Really kind of late compared to when they were originally written. But we can really just see God's working in this because what He maintained throughout all of this is the process. The process of transmission through these scribes was very, very meticulous, and so that we look at and say God is providentially provided and preserved His Word through the process of transmission. We're going to get to the New Testament, and He's going to preserve His Word in a very different way. He's not going to use the scribal process anymore, because you've got churches and letters going all over the place, all over the different churches. And very frankly, church members are not as nearly as meticulous as scribes are, right? Okay.